the way that that can actually help better nourish the world. So now's the time where I need to fade into the background, and I'm going to briefly obscure the screen here, and I'll invite in, and she will basically take over for me for the second half of this. So thank you for your attention, and I'll turn it over to her. You might have to click this to advance.
Thank you. All right. Hello, everybody. I am Anne, and I'm going to carry it forward from here. So I think in many ways, what your food ate is really a culmination of everything that David and I had learned and researched and wrote about in the other books. And you might have thought that we would have started with this book, but in fact, we didn't know what we didn't know until after finishing the other ones. And there really are some pretty profound implications and consequences when it comes to what our food ate. And so this is going to be the part of the talk where I really sort of unpack some of these things. There's far more material in the book, and so I'm really just going to sort of touch on the highlights, but I think it will be enough to whet your appetite, and you'll see what it is that's really at stake here. And it turns out, when you think about it, agriculture and medicine are two of humanity's greatest endeavors, our greatest endeavors. Agriculture starting some 10,000 years ago, and we've always been trying to, doctor ourselves, help our friends, families, and communities through the practice of medicine. And diet has a lot to do with how we're practicing agriculture and medicine. And the lens I'm going to talk about for what your food ate, agriculture and medicine, it has to do with the relatively new area of human biology and science that's focused on human health. And it's about microbiomes. So quite simply, microbiomes are groups of microbes that are in and on their host organism. And we know that many of these microbes, individuals in these communities and whole communities, they dovetail with the cells and genes of their host organism. That could be a person, that could be a plant, a fish, and so on. And really what we're learning about microbiomes is they play sort of dual roles. They help their host organism acquire and process things from the soil if they're a plant, things from the human diet if they are in a human being. But they also can actually create beneficial compounds and turn nutrients into beneficial compounds. This turns out to be part of the pathway and route by which the human microbiome and actually the microbiome of farm animals, how they keep their hosts healthy. And when it comes to the microbiome players, they're up here on this slide, and it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around a microbiome, in part because these are some of the tiniest creatures on Earth. Most of them consist of a single cell. You need a microscope really to see them. And I'm sure you're all familiar with some of these. Bacteria, of course, viruses. We now know far more about their influence on our lives due to COVID. But even fungi are a microbiome member. Archaea and protists, these are other kinds of microbes. So they all associate in communities, often in ways where the waste product or byproduct of the metabolic process of one of these organisms becomes the feedstock for another. And this is what keeps them together as a community in many cases. And everything has a microbiome. Don't fret, I'm going to walk you through this slide. What you'll see here is that what I wanted to talk about is the way in which these different colors around that are signifying the microbiome membership. Just take a look at this color here and how much more there is in the upper end of the digestive tract of a cow than in its lower end, in the colon. And this particular color relates to this large, very large group of bacteria. And what we know about the diversity of microbiomes is that it relates to function, what it is they're doing in their host organism. Okay, I'm going to skip down here to a couple of plants, and you'll see this orange area is pretty different in rice and soybeans and corn. So the same kind of idea here. Basically, you want a diverse microbiome, generally speaking, especially when these microbes are doing beneficial things, because it translates directly to function. And we want normal function with a microbiome, whatever its host organism is. And that brings me, of course, to plants. Plants, whether they are our domesticated plants or those that are in wild plant communities. Things work very, very similar when it comes to the plant microbiome in those two major groups of plants. And the heart of the plant microbiome is in a wild and alive place beneath our feet that is called the rhizosphere. And what drives much of this activity in the rhizosphere is compounds called exudates. If we were able to go down there in the soil and probe and peer and investigate what is happening at the tip of each and every root hair, it might look something like this. So exudates are in liquid form, and the plant is making them and then pushing these exudates out into the soil through the very tips of their root hairs. And here's an illustration of what that might look like. We're going to blow up that area at the end of a root hair. Exudates are flowing out of that. Dave talked a little bit about the fetching fungi. They're consuming these exudates. Fungi, of course, they can't photosynthesize. Plants can. Plants are using all of this energy that they get from photosynthesis to make compounds. Fungi are consuming them. Bacteria are consuming these exudates as well. And what bacteria can do is they can turn these exudates directly or indirectly into a vast array of compounds that the plant then takes back up. Some of these compounds are things like plant growth promoting hormones. So here, in a sense, the botanical world has farmed out a bit of its growth strategy to microbes in the soil. That's pretty interesting. And a lot of what fungi or bacteria might bring back to a plant, it could be hormones, it could be nutrients, but it also can be information and intelligence about what is happening in the larger world around a plant in the soil. Maybe pathogens are approaching. Perhaps there's a nutrient source or a water source that the microbiome might be communicating with its plant host about. Now, what we really want to be happening here is that this microbiome is intact and that it's functioning and that there's a robust conversation between plant and microbiome. And this begins to explain why farming practices are so important to plant health and well-being, as well as that of the microbiome. Remember, I mentioned some of the tiniest creatures on Earth. You really want to minimize disrupting the soil, disrupting it with tillage or disrupting it with chemicals. Now, Dave showed you those fetching fungi. I want to show you what it looks like inside of a plant cell where you have some of these fetching fungi. These cauliflower-shaped things here in this slide. This is a part of the mycorrhizal fungi. These are the fetchers, and how they are pulling in exudates to power their activities, and how at the same time they're delivering what it is they've fetched from the soil at large, and they're trading it with their plant host. Now, I don't think you even need to be a biologist to realize that this is not only highly effective, it might even seem a bit odd that microbes are living inside of plant cells. But if you're a plant, you're stuck in place, you've got to do something. And what the entire botanical world has done is they've developed these symbiotic relationships. So symbioses are generally mutually beneficial relationships, and this works great if you're a plant stuck in place. This is what's helping you survive. It's also what is helping you from being, a sitting duck out there on the landscape. And you need all of this happening because it's also a part, as I'll get into later, of your defensive strategy. All right, now, how important is all of this exudate production and the microbiome pulling in these exudates and trading with their plant host? It's pretty important. A plant will take up to 30 to 40% of all of this energy that it's making through photosynthesis, and this is what's driving their microbiome in the soil, in the rhizosphere. It's biology is mercilessly efficient when it comes to making and trading energy. It's not like us where we're just sort of flagrantly using energy, whether it's fossil fuel energy or coming out of hydropower. We're not nearly as efficient as the natural world when it comes to how we use this and what we get out of us. So this is a really big deal, something to keep in mind, and it underscores the importance of these symbiotic relationships, the exudates, and what the microbes are giving back to their plant host. Now, exudates are just one form of organic matter in the soil. There's other forms like microbial necromass. Now, what is that? Okay, here it's really simple, dead microbes. All of those microbial communities, they have a pretty rapid turnover rate from generation to generation, but they're like little fertilizer packets in a sense. And when microbes die, they sit there in the soil, and they happen to be quite rich in nitrogen. And this is a key thing that plants need to grow. So these researchers took a look at how much of the organic matter in soil comes from dead microbes. And in their research in forest soils and in grasslands, it was pretty significant. About a third in forest soils and almost 2/3 in grasslands, the organic matter, they were able to trace back to dead microbes. So this is why it's really important that we have a living soil, and why it's really important that our farming practices are not unduly disrupting all of this nutrient cycling that is happening. Now, there's another form of organic matter. Now, I'm a big gardener, a person who thinks about plants a lot. And these were some forms of organic matter that I was kind of scavenging and collecting from nearby places in my neighborhood. And what did I do with all these piles of stuff? Well, I would put them together into different kinds of mulch mixes. Wheelbarrows and wheelbarrows, probably over the course of a decade or so. I never kept count, hundreds at least, hundreds of wheelbarrow fulls of organic matter mixed together in my mulches. I would layer it out onto the beds because this was feeding soil life. You might think of mulches, whether in a garden context or a farm context, they're a bit like a drip irrigation system, only water isn't coming out of this drip irrigation, it's nutrients. Everything that is contained in this organic matter is gradually getting broken down, first by very large life forms in the soil, an earthworm, beetles, things we can see, and it cycles through smaller and smaller forms of soil life, and eventually it gets to the microbes. So my point here is just between exudates and all of these different kinds of organic matter to remind you that this is a diet for soil and for soil life, and it ripples through to the bodies of crops on farmlands and, of course, plants in garden settings. And this is all really a form of plant intelligence. We often think, oh, plants, the brain, it must be above ground, just like us. The brain is on top of the body. But the botanical world does not work like us. Most of their brain, when you really think about it and you see what they're doing and how important their microbiomes are, how important organic matter and farming practices are, this is where plant intelligence resides. And my friends, that means this. This is where the brain is. And so what do we do to get to the brain? We need to think about soil as the greatest gut on earth. And we've got to use the gut to get to the plant brain, because brain food matters a lot. All right, I'm sorry we're not here in person with you, or maybe you're glad now that I tell you I'm going to throw a little quiz at you, okay? These are tomato roots, and they've had 3 different treatments. One is absolutely nothing has been done. One is composted manure, and one is a standard synthetic fertilizer treatment, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so you look at this a bit, you ponder it. Which one do you think is which? All right, here's the answer. Brain food matters a lot, and here's why. Starting at the far left. This isn't half bad, folks. If you've got a pretty decent soil and you haven't robbed all of the soil organic matter out of it, these plants are still working along with their microbiome on accessing the nutrients in that soil, in that organic matter. So I think that's a pretty decent root architecture. I can envision exudates coming out of those roots, feeding the microbiome. Like I said, it's not half bad. All right, the middle image here, conventional. I don't really like that. That tells me that root system is not all that it can be. It's really sort of under potential. And the reason for this in part is that these conventional fertilizers are immediately, a plant can take them up immediately. And they kind of bypass the plant's microbiome. So conventional fertilizers, the basic problem with them is that they leave the plant microbiome, all those fetching fungi, all these bacteria that are consuming exudates and turning them into other things, they're left high and dry on a fertilizer diet. A plant can grow on fertilizers. There's no doubt of that. That's what modern agriculture is all about. But when the plant microbiome down there in the soil isn't fed, that means that the plant is not getting all of these other things that their microbiome makes. And that could be, like I'd mentioned, plant growth promoting hormones. That means information about pathogens. There's a whole array of nutrients and compounds that the plant isn't getting, and that actually makes plants more vulnerable to maladies and diseases. And that means that modern agriculture then has to compensate for a paltry plant microbiome with synthetic chemicals, many of which are toxic. So these are pesticides and our herbicides and so on. And this is just further chiseling away at soil health. All right, on to the third image here. I love this. Look at the effects of composted manure. It's providing a really nice level of organic matter in forms that are accessible to large forms of soil life all the way down to the microbes. This is feeding the plant. You get a really nice cycling between the exudates of plants, between the soil organic matter, and it really becomes a virtuous loop. And it makes sense. The plant is well fed, the microbiome is well fed. This is what we like. All right. So what David and I realized in thinking about what our plant and animal foods eat, that the soil has a diet of itself, and that soil diet ripples on up directly, of course, into plants. Uh, I'll draw your attention to the two biggest arrows on this slide. So what we get with a fertilizer diet is actually sort of an excess in too many cases of these synthetic forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Makes plants grow, but I explained the problem is that it also means down here, not really ideal amounts of these microbial metabolites. Soil health diet, we like this. And here's why. Look at the size of this arrow. We're getting an abundance of these beneficial microbial metabolites. We're getting fetching fungi are up on their game, bacteria are up on their game, the plant is benefiting. Now, we can also get a perfectly adequate amount of NP and K out of the organic matter that our microbes are helping to cycle. This was the whole story that Dave talked about in the Kofi Boa story about in Ghana. And so you can get NPK, those the doubling and the tripling of the yields, that wasn't due to synthetic fertilizers. That was due to the soil health diet. Okay, now, so here's your upshot. This is really a health and nutrition plan for soil and crops, fully functioning plant microbiome. And we often, too often, I would say, in my opinion, we think we need super health or super immunity or super diet. Actually, folks, we just need normal. Normal is fine. What is happening in too many cases in agricultural settings, garden settings, and as I'll get into with the human diet, we're getting abnormal. We just need to transition back to normal. I think it's a bit over the top to be talking about super and extra and ultra, because normal is what we've always had, and we've just been veering away from that. And I'm going to transition now to the animal part of what your food ate. Because as surely as the soil, what we feed our animals has profound implications on their health and well-being. And so what we write about, what we realized in writing what your food ate is whether soil health, crop health, animal health, or human health, we have what we call the Fab Four. And these particular things up here on the slide turn out to be really important for our health, and these are also things that farming practices can profoundly influence. Dave covered micronutrients, and I'm going to cover in these next set of slides the phytochemicals, fat balance, and microbial metabolites. And I'll have to say that when it comes to probably the most iconic kind of farm animal, which is a ruminant, shown here, ruminants include cows, sheep, and goats. And in looking at their inherent and innate biology, it seemed to me that sometimes it was a question of, what is this organism? Is it animal? Is it vegetable? Or is it miracle? And the reason for that is that it has to do with this place in the ruminant digestive tract. So the rumen is this big barrel or keg-shaped part of the ruminant digestive tract. It is the first area that anything a ruminant eats, it lands in the rumen. And I know that we've probably all heard about cows having 4 stomachs. That's really not very accurate. And stomachs are sort of dissolvers of things. The rumen is really an ecosystem. And just as the rhizosphere is sort of the heart of the crop microbiome, the rumen is the heart of the microbiome, certainly for cattle, sheep, and goats. In fact, it's another biological bazaar. And it's hard for us humans to wrap our minds around the rumen. I like this illustration because it kind of gets at that. We can see the rumen is a three-dimensional thing. Okay, just get that in your mind. And then I want you to envision that food, all of these plants, and we hope living plants, which I'll get into in a moment, we hope living plants are coming into this rumen because the cow microbiome gets a hold of these plants that have been all chewed up and mixed with saliva, and they start to ferment all of these plant foods. And these fermentation processes, you can have it, something at the beginning of the fermentation process. That's a little bit what this fiber mat is about in the upper half of this illustration, all more down to this liquid zone in the bottom. So these are just sort of different levels of fermentation. There's a lot of feedback between the rumen and the ruminant brain if something's not chewed up enough. This is what all of this rumination is about. It moves out of the rumen back into the cow's mouth. I'm not kidding you. And it gets re-chewed because it's not processed enough. Comes back into the rumen, and the microbiome says, aha, we like this. Now we can really proceed with the rest of the fermentation process. So in many ways, ruminant animals are like four-legged living composters. All right, we've probably all had a compost pile in our garden, maybe on our farm. And what is really different about the ruminant and our compost piles is that there's feedbacks constantly, all of the time, between the animal and this particular kind of composting system. It's really dynamic. It's really hard to study because feedstocks are different all the time. You have these different levels of fermented plants. Rumen is communicating with the animal's brain. So this is really complex, really intricate, and really important for animal health. And one of the things that makes it so important for animal health is phytochemicals. Not these ones in particular. I just put these up here because I'm figuring you're all a little more familiar with phytochemicals that are sort of more a little bit in the human world. So linalool, that's something that's found in lavender. Sulforaphane, that's something that's found in like broccoli, kale. Curcumin down here in the bottom of the slide. That's one of the key types of phytochemicals in the spice that we know as turmeric. So phytochemicals, there are thousands of them, maybe even tens of thousands. And this is part of the plant lifestyle. These phytochemicals help plants live out and thrive in their stuck-in-place lifestyle. It's what protects them from these harsh UVA, ultraviolet, and UVB sun rays. It acts like a sunscreen for them. It's also, phytochemicals are a big, big part of plant defense. It's okay if an insect herbivore nibbles on a little bit of a leaf. We don't want the insect herbivore taking down a whole garden or a whole crop. Phytochemicals push back on herbivores. And more recently, scientists have been learning about the way that plants use phytochemicals to communicate among themselves, from plant to plant, say tree to tree in a forest. And they're also communicating about pathogens, about nutrient sources, all of these things. So phytochemicals are really like the pharmacy that a plant taps into. And they are also important for herbivores' lifestyle. That's all these animals eat. Ruminants are highly specialized herbivores because of the rumen. And they are also, in fact, plant-based food, right? That's the herbivore lifestyle. And what we know about that specialized herbivore lifestyle is this. An herbivore, a ruminant, will put together its meal anywhere from 3 to 5 different plant species. But it sort of zeroes in on exactly which 3 to 5 by taking in, over the course of a day, little nibbles, little samples of somewhere between 50 to 75 other plant species. So just as I had talked about the brain of the plant being in the rhizosphere, you might say that the brain of a ruminant is really here in the rumen. And you want that rumen supplied with as much intelligence as possible, because it makes for ruminants that are healthy, content, really living out the kind of lifestyle that fits their innate biology. And tannins here, shown on this slide, tannins are a type of phytochemical. Most of the plants, if not all, that ruminants eat have some type of tannin in them. And what is known about tannins are some of these benefits. Picture bacterial pathogens. Oh, tannins can knock those back if animals are eating enough of them. Oh, apoptotic, what this means, apoptosis is how the body gets rid of abnormal cells that are on their way to cancer or already cancerous. We want those cells to die off and we want them out of the body. Tannins can influence that in a positive way. Another thing that tannins can do in the diet. Eating and metabolizing food can be kind of hard on our cells and tissues. It creates a sort of exhaust, if you will, and we want to clean all of that exhaust out of the body. And so tannins in adequate levels in the ruminant diet do the same thing for ruminants, keeping those cells and tissues kind of cleaned out of the exhaust so they can function not super, not extra, just normal. Normal is fine, folks. So how are we going to get phytochemicals into the animal foods that become a part of the human diet? Well, living plants. This is what this whole grass-fed term is all about. It's a bit of a misnomer. We're not just talking about grasses, right? What we want is we want animals to have access, in about 3 to 5 plants for any given meal, about 50 to 75 that they can sample. The rumen can interact with all of those phytochemicals, feedback between the brain and the rumen. It determines the behavior of the animal about which plants to select. All right? So this is what this study found out. Researchers found out. They looked at across 22 studies, primarily at these major groups of phytochemicals, the carotenoids, tocopherols, polyphenols, terpenoids. And were these animals on a pasture diet or on a concentrate diet? So a concentrate diet, we can just pretty much say that's what animals that live in a feedlot are eating. They're not exactly deciding what to eat. It's the human being who's decided what the animal is going to eat. And these concentrate diets are I'll get into it a little bit. They're just not good for the animal. They foul up the microbes that live in the rumen. And one thing we know about microbiomes is when they don't get their preferred diet, they are still churning out metabolites. Many of these metabolites, however, are bad for their host organism. And this is sort of chiefly the problem with feeding animals in feedlots. Out on diverse pastures, though, this is what the study found. Wow, phytochemical levels 2 to 20 times higher in the meat and dairy of on this type of a diet than animals that are in a feedlot. So, if you're not the words kind of person, here's a picture of what I am talking about and what these researchers found out. So, grain-fed kind of a diet, we do not want that. That does not imbue the ruminant body with much in the way of phytochemical diversity or richness. You really want what it says right here. Plant species diverse diet. Introduces a lot more phytochemicals into the animal's diet. That makes for better lifestyle for them, and it puts more phytochemicals in the animal foods in our diet. And so really, I can kind of sum it up this way for you. The rumen is really the metabolic terrain for the microbiome, and that means that what the microbiome is producing is driving the health and well-being of the animal. All right, on to fats. So this term, fat of the land, we've probably all bumped into it, but here's where that term sort of originated from, at least in the scientific sense. We call living, leafy parts of a plant the fat of the land because omega-3 fats, you probably heard of those, are often associated with cold water fish like salmon, but they are in plants too. And the reason they're in plants is they are fundamental to photosynthesis. Low levels of omega-3s or no omega-3s in a plant is not able to photosynthesize. So, for example, you wouldn't find much in the way of omega-3s in, say, a root or a woody part of a plant because that part isn't photosynthesizing. They're really concentrated, our omega-3 fats, in living and leafy, all right? And, oh, here's what that kind of a lifestyle looks like. Ruminants that are out in pasture eating the leafy and the living are taking in an abundance of omega-3 rich fats. So it's not just sort of a dietary thing, it's a whole lifestyle thing when it comes to ruminants and omega-3 fats. So you can contrast that with what we call an omega-6 rich diet. Now, a seed is a different part of the plant than a leaf. Seeds have a really different purpose in the plant world. You want that seed to hit the ground, you want it to ruminate, you want it to germinate and grow. And so omega-6 fats are rich in seeds for that reason. Those kind of fats are part of the germination, part of the energy storage that goes into plants germinating and getting off to a good start. And what we know about modern animal agriculture is the diet is rich in omega-6s. We're feeding them a ton of grains. This messes up the rumen, throws the pH off in the rumen, and that leads to all kinds of metabolic problems for our ruminants. And so let's leave that picture aside and let's talk about the positive things that we do want to do when we're raising animals that end up in the human diet. It really goes like this. We want the living and the leafy because it's not only the beneficial fat balance, but it's fiber. This is what the microbes in the rumen are consuming. They want fermentable fiber. And so that's the lifestyle of the microbiome. And it also comes down to this, phytochemical richness and variety for the animal and for their microbiome. So again, what does that look like? It looks like this. In essence, fats, phytochemicals, and fiber, this is the health plan for ruminants. This is how we stop over-medicating animals in agriculture with the slew of pharmaceuticals that end up in soil, in the meat, and in the dairy, and so on. The health plan for ruminants was and always has been their diet. And so, in many ways, it's not the cow, it's the how. It's how the human beings are working with or against the innate biology of ruminants. And what we know about ruminants, it's not just our domesticated animals. It's things like moose, it's deer, it's all of these grazing animals that have been in co-evolved with the greatest grasslands on our planet. This is grasslands in the Midwest. This is places like the Serengeti. This is the great grasslands in in Ukraine and Russia. The health plan for ruminants has always been grazing on diverse, phytochemically laden plants that are living and so therefore rich in omega-3s. And I put this up here because Louis Pasteur, the great French chemist and microbiologist, several hundred years ago. So Louis Pasteur is the one who, he with the great German microbiologist Robert Koch, gave us germ theory. These were the folks that figured out, oh, the microbial world can also be the vehicle for disease. Sort of one germ, this disease, a different germ, a different disease. So Pasteur was very focused on pathogens and thought it's only pathogens that matter. But in fact, he is said to have said this on his deathbed. He began to realize that the setting, the environment, the context in which pathogens are living influences whether or not they really get a foothold into a plant, an animal, or a person. So the pathogen is nothing and the terrain is everything. This is where diet intersects with microbiomes, with the rumen, and as I'll get into, our very own bodies. And so phytochemicals and fats that the animal takes in, they ripple into foods in the human diet, and that becomes a factor in our own health. And what I want to do now is just set the stage before I kind of fold out and loop back to this fat thing. So it has to do with this, with the kinds of diseases and maladies that have been affecting human populations in more recent times. This graph on the left is just showing various infectious diseases, rheumatic fever, measles, and the biggest thing lately, of course, has been COVID. AIDS could also be on this slide for that matter. AIDS and COVID are a bit of exceptions, but we have definitely pushed back on many of the most dread infectious diseases that have taken down, the generations of, say, our grandparents and great-grandparents. Contrast that with the graph on the right. In the same time frames, this is just sort of right after World War II and on forward into the 1980s and forward, infectious diseases had definitely been declining, but these other types of diseases, these are the so-called chronic diseases, they're really increasing. And one thing we know about many chronic diseases is they tend to be some kind of disordered immune response. And remember, I've mentioned this word that we really need just normal. In other words, these chronic diseases are some of these abnormal functioning and abnormal things that our immune system is doing. So many people have wondered, well, why? Where is all this abnormal functioning coming from? And it's not just a few of us that are having an abnormal sort of response to many things. It's 7 of 10 of us have one or more chronic diseases that are linked to our diet, and that diet is linked to some kind of disordered immune response. And that, I'm going to loop back to fats for this next section. So on the left here, these are just these different populations that you can see, starting at the Paleolithic and heading on down to current Indian populations. And the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fats in the diets. And this ratio, as you can see, okay, back in the Paleolithic period, that ratio just under 1. Greece prior to 1960 shown here, we've got about 1 omega-6 fat to about 2 omega-3s. Oh, the US today, wow, about almost 17, the ratio of omega-6, omega-3 about 17 to 1. In other words, we're taking in a lot more omega-6s than omega-3s in the sort of standard American diet. And that's not ideal. What we really want is roughly about the same amount of omega-6s as omega-3s in the human diet. whether we're getting these through our plant foods or our animal foods. Just roughly about the same. That's why when we talk about the Fab Four, we don't just say fats, we say fat balance.